I want you to open your Bibles tonight, the Old Testament, the book of Genesis. Once upon a time, there was a little boy, started in the first grade. His first day at school, he wanted to impress his parents with what he had learned, and so he got one of the older children to teach him part of the multiplication table. So he went home that night and stood in front of Mommy and Daddy, stuck out his chest and said, 2 times 2 equals 4. And his mother and dad just thrilled to death. They just couldn't believe it. Here was their young little boy, just the very first day in school, and already he was multiplying. And they were just beaming with pride and bursting with joy because what they had always suspicioned was now confirmed, that their little darling was a genius. And so while they were standing there beaming and bursting, the little boy looked up at him and said, "What's a 2?" I have a suspicion that many a time you and I in our Christian life use some words and terminology like that. We grow up with them. I made a statement, I think it was this morning, that we live by slogans. Really, our Christianity, if you get right down to it, for many of us, living it is reduced to simply living by slogans. It's not that those slogans are not true, it's just that beyond them we don't know much about them. They're just slogans. Slogans are funny things. They captivate us and we believe them without ever questioning them. Ivory Snow, 99 and 444, 100% pure. I've been listening to that for 40 years. They've never said pure what. Could be pure ground glass. We live by slogans. And there are certain words and phrases that we grow up hearing and using and never really understanding them, but we get to the place where it's embarrassing to ask what they mean. It's like knowing someone for several years, and after you've known them so long, it's embarrassing to ask their name. You're supposed to already know it. And I have an idea that when we talk about faith and belief and trusting in God, pretty much the same way. I've always been impressed by people who have reputations for faith and trusting God. First time I got to know Brother Manley Beasley real well, I was in awe of it. Here was a man who had a reputation for believing God and trusting God. Something about that. And so we talk about, I'm just trusting God. I'm going to believe God for this. But I really think that sometimes deep down underneath we'd love to be able to say, what's a belief? What's a trust? How do you do it? What does it mean to do it? I've been saying I'm going to trust God for this for so many years, and to tell you the truth, I don't have the slightest idea how to go about it. We talk about walking in faith. What in the world does that mean anyway? Does that mean just doing the best I can, or do I get a word from God? And you know, God deals differently with everybody. He deals with us according to our personality. I mentioned Manley Beasley, and I mention him because I love him and he's a dear friend, but God works differently with Manley than he works with me. Manley's always hearing God. I remember one day we were driving along in the car. He was in my church in a meeting. We were driving along in the car, and they'd been quiet. All of a sudden, Manley kind of, well, amen. I said, what's the matter? He said, God just told me something. Now, folks, you can blacklist me if you want to. God has never talked to me like that. I mean, I've tried and tried and tried. God just doesn't talk to me like that. Thankfully, He doesn't. I'm not so certain I'd be able to understand. But God works differently with us, and we hear some people talking about walking with God, and What does it mean to walk with God? I think this matter of faith and trusting God and living as God wants us to be is like anything else in life. I think we need to be shown. I don't know how you are, but there are times when I say to the Lord, Lord, I am so dense and I am so dumb that if you want me to understand what you're talking about, you're going to have to get a lot clearer than you are at this moment. You're going to have to spell it out for me, make it very clear. When I was in school, the teacher could explain a math problem, but I have trouble understanding instructions. I can't read it. They're all written by IRS writers anyway, and I can't understand instructions. And she would explain how to work a certain problem, but it never would sink in. But if she'd turn around to the blackboard and work a problem on the board and I could see her doing it, then, you see, I could understand it. What I need to do is to watch somebody. Show me. Let me see how you do it. What are the physical aspects? How do you go about it? And Lord, if you'd just show me somebody going through the motions of believing you and trusting you, then I think I'd know a little bit more about it. This abstract business, it has to become concrete. The Word must always become flesh. These principles have to become persons for me to really get a hold of them. And I think that's what God has done in the matter of faith. And so what I want to do tonight is to look at the model of faith, the example of faith, a man whose name is synonymous with the just shall live by faith. And you know who I'm talking about, Abraham. His name is synonymous with faith. And if you want to know what it means to trust God, believe God, then I think that you can gain a lot of insight by following him along and seeing how he does it. The very first time the word believe is found in the Bible, in Genesis 15, it's found in reference to Abraham. As far as we have any reference, that's the first time, and he was the first man of whom it was said, Abraham believed the Lord, and it was counted to him for righteousness. In Romans chapter 4, Paul holds up Abraham as the father of the faith and the father of the faithful, and he says, not only for his sake was it written down, but for our sakes also. And basically what he's saying is, as we observe Abraham, if you and I believe as Abraham believed, we can receive as Abraham received. And so what I want us to do this evening is just to put a surveillance on Abraham, following him along, see how God leads him, how God deals in his life, see what it means to walk by faith. Now, I've selected what I believe to be are the three great crises of faith in this man's life. And we're going to look at them because I believe they're also the three great crises in the life of any person who would dare to say, I'm trusting God and my faith is in Him. And so I want you to turn, first of all, to the 12th chapter of Genesis. Genesis chapter 12, and this is where it really all begins. Now, in the latter verses of chapter 11, you have a kind of mini genealogy there, talking about Abraham and his father and where they came from. But the real story of Abraham begins in chapter 12 and verse 1. And we'll read the first three verses. This is the initial call of God to Abraham. This is the starting place of faith. This is where his walk with God began as far as Abraham's consciousness was concerned. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house into a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great. And thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Now, verse 1 really is the main verse, the key verse around which we want to gather our thoughts tonight. The Lord came to Abram and said, Get thee out, get thee out, get out of thy country and of thy kindred and of thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. The very first word of God to Abraham, as far as we have any record of, was a word of separation. Now, I want to say something just by way of preliminary here. There are many definitions of faith that you could give, and all of them would be correct. Faith is that big of word. No single definition will adequately describe it. And many definitions can be given, all of them correct. I'd like to give a definition tonight. I think faith, in one way of looking at it, faith is letting go of one thing that we might take hold of another. Always, it seems to me, in faith, in God's dealing with man, there is involved separation. He said, I want you to get out of the country. I want you to get out. His very first word. And as we follow Abraham tonight, you're going to find all the way through there's that theme of separation. What God does, He takes a man and begins to shave those external attachments off his life until he comes to the place where there is no more having and there is just being. To make a reference to last night. I had intended, but I don't think I'll have the time tonight to go back into Genesis and the creation story. And you'll see there the character of God revealed in creation as concerns separation. God separated the night from the day. God separated the water that was from above from the water that was from beneath. God's works of creation, in fact, were all works of separation, of making things distinctive and different. Male and female created Him, them. He made them different. And all the way through the Bible, you'll find that same doctrine expounded, even into the New Testament. Jesus said, He that does not love me more than father or mother, sister, brother, cannot be my disciple. He has to be willing to leave, to be separated, to be cut off. Always the call of God is to get out. Now, this initial call to Abraham, He says, I want you to get out of thy country. Now notice how God narrows it down. He starts off with that which is easiest. He starts off broadly. He says, get out of your country, but it's really more than that. Get away from your kinfolks, but it's really more than that. And from thy father's house. It's as though God realizes that this is going to be a traumatic experience for Abraham. It's not going to be easy for him to leave. And so God starts at the outer edge of easiness. And that's where usually God starts with us. God, in our infancy, as far as faith is concerned, always starts with that which is easy. He accommodates Himself to our infancy. He accommodates Himself to us, to our inability. And so He starts with that which is easy. It's not easy, but it's the easiest. I want you to leave your country. Okay, I can leave my country. But wait just a minute. I want you to leave your kindred, your kinfolks. And okay, I can do that. And I want you to leave your father's house. And I want you to go into a country that I will show thee. Now, you know, today, it's very difficult for us in this 20th century, being accustomed as we are to our own culture, to read something that happened thousands and thousands of years ago and make the transition and say, well, sure, I understand. All God is asking Abraham to do is to leave his country, his kindred, and his father's house and go into a country. We do that every day. Our children get married and they leave Louisiana, they leave mom and dad, they leave their relatives and they move to California to get a job, or they go into the armed forces and they're transferred to Germany. Why, we move every day. Some of us have moved across the country 2 or 3 times. Nothing to that. That's a sacrifice, but it's no big deal. You can always pick up the phone and reach out and keep in touch. You can write a letter. You can get on an airplane and be back home in an hour or 2 and keep in touch. It's no big deal. But we miss the point of the whole story. What we fail to realize is that back in those days, the people gathered in cities not only for protection, but also that was the culture, that was the society. The most despised people of that day were nomads, what we today would call gypsies. They were people that had no roots. They were people that had no permanent dwelling places. They were suspicious people. They were transients. You watched out for them. And when you saw them coming, you locked up your tents, and you locked up your camels, and you locked up your daughters, because these were transients. These were gypsies. They had no permanent dwelling place. Worst of all, they had no permanent burial ground, which was immensely important to the people of that day. What God is actually asking Abraham to do is to leave the society that he knows, to leave civilization, to leave the warmth and the security of that which he knows, to leave the values of the culture in which he was raised, and to become a despised nomad, to strike out and live as a wanderer, as a transient, to live in the desert, not knowing where he's going from day to day. What he's asking Abraham to do is to leave the known for the unknown, to leave the seen for the unseen. He's asking Abraham to commit himself to a life of total uncertainty. You see, there is warmth and security in living in our society because we are accustomed to it, and there are certain mores and certain taboos and certain standards that tell us how to live, so we don't have to think too much for ourselves. And anything we want there is right here. And our family is there to minister to us, and there is security living within our civilization. When God comes, He says, I want you to give up all the values of your society, what society thinks is right and wrong, what society thinks is of value and of no value. I want you to leave all of that warmth and security, and I want you to strike out and to become a nomad. I want you to become a transient. I want you to go out just at my word, with no guarantee, no map, traveling under sealed orders, which is what you always do when you walk with God, traveling under sealed orders and finding your reward in that which you will never live to see with your own eyes. I want you to leave. I want you to live a life of uncertainty as far as what you can see is concerned. To strike out into the unknown, to strike out into the invisible, and just trust me. And when Abraham left, he left behind him one thing, but he took with him another. He left behind all worldly knowledge and evaluation and comfort and security, but he took with him his faith. And you have to leave behind one thing in order to take hold of another. Faith invariably involves letting go of the security of this life, the security of knowing where I am, the security of knowing what I have. You see, after you've done it, it might not seem so risky. But before you do it, it sure does seem risky. You see, every new step involves failure. Every new step, there is the danger of failure. That's the reason most of us are willing to give up our freedom to stay right where we are, because we know what we have here. I mean, I may not have much and I may not have the best, but at least I know what I've got. And you're asking me to strike out and follow God and engage in a new enterprise. Listen, there is the risk of failure there. Always it's risky. And when it's said and done, I might look back and say, well, there wasn't any risk at all. Well, that's nice after the fact, but when you're facing it, it's filled with risk, and the fear of failure and the fear of winding up lost in the wilderness and becoming the laughing stock of your friends is enough to make anybody stay home when God says go. And I tell you something, all faith and walking with God involves the willingness, my willingness, to leave behind that which is known, to exchange the known for the unknown, and to be willing to find my reward in that which I will not see and may never live to see. I remember reading over in Exodus chapter 33, it was, when Moses had been dealing with God's people. He'd been trying to lead them, but you know how they were. They were hard to lead, and God had been having trouble with them, and He had finally had it up to here with them, and He said, I don't have anything to do with them. And you remember the story, Moses interceded for the people. And so in Exodus chapter 33, God said to Moses, all right, Moses, I've heard your prayer, and okay, we're going to give it another try. I want you to get up and take this people and take them into the promised land. Go ahead and lead them. Now, do you remember what Moses said in reply? One of the most famous incidents in biblical history. Do you remember what Moses said in reply? God said, I want you to start out again. I've heard your prayer, and I've forgiven them this time, and we're going to try to make it to the land one more time. You take off and you lead them. Moses said, well, okay, I'll tell you what, though. This time, Lord, having had experience with this bunch and knowing that we can end up in a lot of trouble, I'm willing to trust you, but there's one thing that would help. Lord, show me thy face. Lord, if I could just see you from the front. I'm so tired of seeing you from the back. Lord, if I could just see you up front, see you from the front, and know what you've got out there in front of you and planned. Lord, show me thy face, and that'll be all right. And God says, no, you can't see my face. He put him in the cleft of the rock, covered his face with his hand. He passed before him. And the Bible says Moses saw only the backside of God. I want to tell you something, folks. The only part of God you ever see is his back. You say, what in the world are you getting at? What I'm getting at is that most of us can only see God in retrospect. You see, while I am going through certain trials, and while I'm going through certain uncertainties, and while I'm traveling through certain wildernesses where there is no friendly voice and where there is no water, and God seems to be a million miles away, I can't see God anywhere. I can't find God anywhere. But years later, when I've come through it, I look back and I say, well, my soul, well, God was leading me each step of the way. It's just as plain as day. Well, look right out there. You can see every print. You can see every step. Do you know what I'm talking about? You can see God in retrospect, but that's the only way you can see Him. I want to tell you something. God's never going to show you His face this side of glory. He won't even show you His face then. You'll see Jesus. God's never going to show you what's up front. He's never going to give you a preview of coming attractions in this world. But that's what we want. We say, Lord, it'd be so easier to lead this bunch. It'd be so easier to pastor this church. So easier, much easier to be a husband and a father. It'd be so easy, much easier to follow you and trust you if you just let me see you from your face. I want to see your face. I want to get a good look at you so I'll know you next time I see you and make certain you're the God that I'm supposed to be following. God says, no, can't show you that. You can see me from the back. And I stand and I look back and I can see God in retrospect so easy. I hit myself over the head. How did I miss Him the first time around? You know, the most amazing thing of all is that you make history and don't even know it. I am confident that about 175 years ago in our country, a doctor delivered a baby one day, or maybe it was a midwife back in those days, delivered a little baby in Springfield, Illinois. But I'm confident that that doctor did not run home to his wife and say, guess who was born today? Who? Abraham Lincoln. When he was born, nobody had any idea that was Abraham Lincoln. I'm confident that in Stratford, England, some 200 and so years ago, when a little boy was born to James Shakespeare, that the doctor or midwife didn't run home that night and say, guess who was born today? William Shakespeare. Who? Nobody looking at that little baby would have ever imagined that's William Shakespeare. You and I look at our little lives and we say, who, what, nothing, 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 nothing. There's nothing, there's nothing, there's nothing. My friend, you may be making history, not even know it. God's not going to show you His face. He's not going to show you up front. You're going to see it in retrospect. You're going to have to walk with Him in the unknown. I've done a lot of study in revival. We pray for revival all the time. And you know, the more I study about revival, I get the sneaking suspicion half of those people didn't know they were having it when they had it. You say, that can't be true. Then you tell me why everybody under the sun fought it. Why was everybody fighting it? Why? Because they didn't know it was happening. They didn't know what it was. But you let those same people 20 years later, a generation later, say, oh yeah, I was there at the Great Revival. Of course, I didn't recognize it at the time, and I was fighting tooth and nail against it, but now I look back in retrospect and I see that it was a great revival. Friends, that's why you have to wait to write history. And that's why the judgment comes at the end, not in the middle. That's why a man's work's going before him and why he may die right now, yet God doesn't judge him right now. He waits till the end time. Why? Because, son, the influence of your life is going to keep on accumulating throughout the ages, and only when everything is finally brought down to a finish, only then can God really measure up the impact and influence of your life, you see. But all along you've walked in darkness. I tell you something, the greatest saints of God never had the sneakiness idea they were the saints of God. The greatest saints of God. They walked in lowliness and obscurity and wondered why God had abandoned them, and yet today we pore over their biographies and pray God would make us just like they were, and then God doesn't. We wonder why He's abandoned us. You've got to be willing to leave, son. Leave what's known. Leave what's stable. Leave what is secure. Leave what you can see with your hands and eyes and taste, and leave all of that. And strike out and travel under sealed orders. Leave the known for the unknown. Leave the visible for the invisible, and say, I'm willing to find my reward in that which I may never live to see. That's the call that God brought to Abraham. It's living in the not yet. That's what it is. Well, the second crisis that came to Abraham in this walk of faith came over in chapter 17. Chapter 17 of Genesis. I made reference today to this. I meant chapter 15 when I made reference to when God said, Abraham, I've given you myself. And Abraham said, what will you give me? I think I quoted 17. And before someone comes up tonight and corrects me, I want to correct myself. It's chapter 15. But I want you to look in chapter 17. We have here the interesting story of God and Abraham and Ishmael. You know the story. God had promised to Abraham that he was going to give to he and Sarah a son, and out of this son should all the nations of the earth be blessed. And they walked away from that promise with joy in their hearts, and yet as the time went by and the years elapsed, Sarah was barren. She could have no children. And so one day Sarah came to Abraham and said, listen, Abraham, it looks as though we're going to have to do our bit for world redemption. And I can't have a son, and time's a wasting, and you're getting on in years, and if God's going to be able to bring the Redeemer through us, He needs our help. I want you to take Hagar, my little handmaiden, and I want you to go into her, and I want you to have a son by her. So Abraham did what Sarah suggested, and Hagar brought forth a son. But the Bible says at that moment that Sarah became despised in her eyes, because it was a disgrace among the Hebrews for a woman to be unable to bear children. And Sarah didn't know what she was letting herself in for. And when Hagar had little Ishmael, she'd look at Sarah, and Sarah could see the despite in her eyes. It made Sarah angry, and she came to Abraham, and she said, Abraham, it's all your fault. Well, it wasn't his fault. It was her idea. But Abraham loved Ishmael. Abraham loved Ishmael, loved him with all of his heart. Now, in Genesis chapter 17, God comes to Abraham again and renews the covenant, renews the promise. Now look at verse 15. And God said unto Abraham, as far as Sarai thy wife, thou shalt call her name Sarai. Not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. And Abraham fell upon his face and laughed, and said in his heart, shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear? Now watch it, verse 18. And Abraham said unto God, oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. God says, son, if you're going to walk with me, first thing you've got to be willing to do is leave your country. Second thing, you've got to be willing to leave Ishmael. You're going to have to get rid of Ishmael. You're going to have to get rid of Ishmael in order to take hold of faith and take hold of promise. Once you get rid of Ishmael, drive him out. That's not my plan. That's not my way. That's your idea. Ishmael represents man's determined effort to take matters into his own hands. Ishmael represents man's effort to take matters into his own hands. Ishmael is man's contribution to God's work, man's idea. And God comes and says, Sarah's going to have a son, and it's out of that son that all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And Abraham said, oh my God, that Ishmael might live before thee. And how many times in various ways you and I have brought that prayer to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. I know that I grow up with a certain vision. I grow up with a certain dream. I have a certain idea. I want my ministry to go a certain way, and I want my family to go a certain way, and I want my wife and my children and my whole ministry, I want it to go a certain way. I have a vision. I have a dream. I have a plan. I visualize it, Brother John. I see it happening. I know what I want. And God comes along and says, I've got different plans. I want you to drive out Ishmael. I want you to give up your vision, give up your dream, give up your plans. And I say, oh God, that Ishmael might live before Thee. That Ishmael might live before Thee. I was ordained to the ministry when I was 17. I surrendered to preach, started preaching when I was 15. I never will forget the night I was ordained. See, I surrendered to preach in order to become the next Billy Graham. I'm not lying, I did. I know you think that's mighty egotistical, but I'm an egotistical person, as we all are. And Billy Graham was at his height, well, he still is, but that was when, he was really being pumped and everything. And man, I mean, that was it, Billy Graham. And when God called me preacher, I knew it was to be the next Billy Graham, no doubt about it. It just made sense to sit down and think about it. I'd been reading the biographies of men like Charles Finney and Spurgeon and Moody and Billy Sunday. No dull, ordinary pastor for me. No, sir. I was going to be the next Billy Graham. I just knew God had found His man. I never will forget that night I was ordained. J. Harold Smith was my pastor, and he never was one to beat around the bush. And he had me sitting right there on the front pew, and in the course of that ordination sermon, he said, son, God did not call you to be another Billy Graham. I almost up and quit right then. That's the most discouraging news I'd ever heard. You know what he said? He said, God calls you to be Ron Dunn. I said to myself, who in the world wants to be him? The will of God, but I was determined I was going to be an evangelist. I never will forget, it's been a number of years ago, but I can remember as though it happened just this afternoon, getting on my face before God and giving up. Giving up my plans, giving up my vision, giving up my dreams. Because all that time I said, oh God, that Ishmael might live before Thee. Ishmael might live before Thee. Lord, this is what I had in mind. This was my plan. This was my dream. This was my vision. And Lord, this is the way. Lord, let Your will somehow be my will. Let Your design somehow fit into my design. Let Your desire somehow be my desire. Oh, that Ishmael might live before Thee. Take what I've done. Take what I've planned. Take what I've suggested and use it. Oh, that Ishmael might live before Thee. God says you're going to drive Ishmael out. You're going to have to give up your plans. Now, of course, what God was doing, or rather what Abraham was doing, is he was trying to delicately and diplomatically sidestep the incomprehensible to the more practical. God came and He said, I'm going to give son to Sarah. You're going to do what? I'm going to give a son to Sarah. And you look in verse 17, then Abraham fell upon his face, which is the proper response the Hebrew would make when God speaks to you. You fall on your face and worship. But then it says, and he laughed in his heart. Didn't laugh out loud, laughed in his heart. Remember when you were a little kid and you'd be in church, training union, and everybody's praying, and you'd pray, laughing under your breath? God said, Sarah is going to bear a child. Abraham fell on his face before God. Sarah's 90 years old. I'm 100 years old. I'm as good as dead. As far as Sarah's concerned, she's always been dead. That's what he's saying. That's what he's saying. He's laughing at God. He's laughing at God. And so he said, oh God, that Ishmael might live before him. Lord, let's don't rush out here now and do something in prayer. That Ishmael might live before Thee. You know what he's trying to do? He's trying to steer God towards a more reasonable plan. I mean, after all, Lord, here's Ishmael in the flesh. You can see him touching, Call for him, he'll come. Tell him to sit down, he'll sit down. Tell him to stand up, he'll stand up. Tell him to go fetch the mules, he'll fetch the mules. Here's Ishmael, flesh and blood and bones and sinew and all that. I mean, you can see Ishmael. I mean, we can work with him. We can do something with him. And I got news for you. An Ishmael in the hand's worth 2 Isaacs in the bush. Lord, it is incomprehensible, it is unbelievable, it is unimaginable that Sarah and I could bring forth a child. Lord, be reasonable, be pragmatic, be practical. Let's use Ishmael. Now what he's saying? Now, it's not in the King James, unfortunately, but it's there in the Hebrew text, verse 19, and God said, no. Period. End of discussion. Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac. Now don't anybody look. Now for the prize, somebody tell me, what does the name Isaac mean? He laughs. He laughs. God says, Sarah's going to bear a child. Abraham, Sarah's going to bear a child. Lord, let's use Ishmael. No, Sarah's going to bear a child. And Abraham, by the way, call his name Isaac. He laughs. And then every time you see that boy, you remember about the time you laughed at me. And every time you call him to supper, you'll remember you laughed at me. And every time you call him in from his chores, you'll remember you laughed at me. And every time you call him to get up, the time to get up, you'll remember you laughed at me. Thou shalt call his name Isaac. Get rid of Ishmael. Now I want to say two things about this before we move on. Number one, God is not bound by our faith. God is not bound by our faith. And I wholeheartedly agree with what John and others have said. Friend, faith is not a means of getting my will done in heaven. It is the means of getting God's will done on earth. This business of just believe all of your heart. What the mind can conceive and the heart can believe, the hand can achieve, is a bunch of hogwash. God has to do what I believe Him to do. God has to do what I believe Him to do. I want to tell you something, friends. God has never made, never will make any promise to anybody that will limit the exercise of His sovereignty. Never will. You're never going to make God jump through hoops. God's not bound by our faith. You can believe all day long. You can believe all you want to. God doesn't have to do what you believe. He's not bound by your faith. But I've got good news for you. He's not bound to it either. He's not bound to it here. Because, you see, Abraham's not believing God. No, it's obvious. Abraham doesn't believe God. Why is he crying out for Ishmael? Why is he clinging to Ishmael? He doesn't believe God. Bless the Lord, God is not bound to our faith. He can work beyond it. If you think He is, then you don't know what God's done in your life. He's worked beyond your faith every time. Not bound by it, He's not bound to it. But you're going to have to be willing to drive out Ishmael. I want to ask you tonight, are you willing to give up your plans and your vision for your church and your vision for your life and your dreams and your plans and all of that and take what God has to offer? Even though you can't see Him, even though there's nothing tangible, even though, again, it means walking under and traveling under sealed orders. Got to drive out Ishmael. Well, there was a third crisis that came to Abraham's life, and that's over in chapter 22. We're familiar with that. Verse 1. And it came to pass, boy, you think it after a while. I sat having dinner the other day with the pastor and his wife. They're my age. They've raised their children through hard times. Now they're just getting to the age where they can enjoy one another. Suddenly he has terminal cancer. My wife sat across that table, tears in her eyes. She said, "Is there no end to it?" You just get through one crisis and you think, now I can coast, now I can enjoy life, and boy, I tell you, wham, here comes another one. All of Abraham's life, one test after another, one test after another, one trial after another. You think, is there no end to it? Finally, Isaac was born, and he loved him. He was the apple of his eye. This was the treasure of Abraham. This was the fruit of his life, hallowed by prayer, ripened by struggle. Everything bound up in Isaac. Everything was just right. Everything was just right. And then come these words, and it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. You know, I can understand I don't really understand it that much, but I can accept it that God would ask him to give up his country so God could lead him to another. And I can really understand God asking him to give up Ishmael, because Ishmael was never on God's schedule anyway. But to give up Isaac? I can understand Abraham being called upon to let go of that which is wrong, that which is of the flesh, that which is outside of the will of God, that work which was not initiated by God nor culminated by God. But Isaac's a whole other story, folks. Isaac was God's idea. Isaac was God's miracle. Abraham wanted to go with Ishmael. He was willing to give up Isaac, forego having Isaac. He would have settled for Ishmael. And God said, No, not Ishmael. Isaac, he's the one. He's the one. And then God comes along, and Isaac is a young man, and he says, I want you to take thy son. Notice he says, thine only son. Well, I thought he had Ishmael. That's what he thought. Thine only son Isaac. Now, notice, God didn't just say, take Isaac and offer him up. It's as though God is putting the knife in it and then twisting it. He says, I want you to take thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, you see, and you take him up into a mountain and you offer him there as a sacrifice. My dear friends, walking with God and following God and trusting God not only means I have to be willing to leave my country, to walk into the unknown. I have to be willing to give up my vision, my plans, my ideas, to drive out Ishmael, but I even have to lay Isaac on the altar. To lay Isaac on the altar. I don't understand that. I don't understand that. Isaac is everything that is good. Isaac is everything that is holy. Isaac is everything that is right. And God is wanting me to lay Isaac on the altar. I don't understand that. I think more may have gone on between Abraham and God than what's recorded here. Of course, we usually assume that. All of this is abbreviated. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe maybe Abraham without saying a word just picked up and left, but I find that a little difficult, especially knowing Abraham's penchant for arguing. Maybe it went like this. I like to think it did. God says, I want you to take Isaac and offer him up as a sacrifice. Abraham says, Isaac, I can't. Isaac is my son. I'm his father. God says, no, he's my son, and I'm his father. You know what God's saying to Abraham? He's saying possession isn't ownership. But he's mine. No, he's not. He's mine. But he looks to me. I'm his father. No, I'm his father. And I got news for you, Abraham. I'm your father too. Do what you're told. But I want to tell you something. I don't know that I quite understand this. I'm quoting a fellow. Back in the, about 12th century, there was a marvelous mystic divine called Master Eckhart. He wrote a lot of mystical stuff. But he was a great saint of God. He said that for us to be totally God's and belong God totally, we must not have anything. He's talking about of ourselves. Ownership. Not my. He said we often say, well, I've given up everything and I've reserved a spot in my heart for God. He said, no, the very language there indicates that you believe you still own your own heart and you can reserve a spot for God. But he said, you haven't made it yet until you recognize that you don't even have a spot for God because you are so absolutely nothing and have nothing to do with your life. And if God wants a spot in your heart, He'll have to create one for Himself, because it's not up to you to make a spot for Him in your heart. Now that is heavy stuff. And I'm not sure I understand that, but I'm afraid that I do. Well, I wonder why I had to put Isaac on the altar. You know the end of this story. Isaac didn't die. No, he didn't die. I think Abraham thought he was. Some people think that Abraham didn't think that he was, but I think Abraham thought he was. I just thought Abraham believed that God raised him from the dead. But Abraham was willing to go through with it, ready to go through it. I don't know wherever he got the strength to hold up that hand, do you? But he did. God said, I don't have all of you yet, Abraham, and I won't have all of you there is to have until I have Isaac. Why? Because he's the nearest and dearest thing to your heart. And are you willing to give up the nearest and dearest and the best? Are you willing to say, I possess him, but I don't own him? I'm not his father, you are. You're not my son, he's your son. You can have him. And when you've got him, nothing left for me to have. You've got all of me there is to have. Isaac didn't die that day, but somebody did. And I'm not talking about the ram caught in the thicket. I'm talking about Abraham. See, it was absolutely essential that Abraham die to Isaac. Abraham died to Isaac. Now, I don't think I need to take a lot of time making an application of this. You make your own application. It'll be better than what I can do anyway. You got an Isaac in your life you're struggling with. You still believe you own it simply because you possess it. I think for many a minister, it's his ministry. Becomes your Isaac. Becomes your Isaac. Folks, there's a difference between serving the ministry and serving God. It took me a lot of years to realize that when I answered the call to preach, it wasn't necessarily answering the call to God. You can surrender to the ministry and never surrender to God. And you get to pampering your ministry and covering your ministry and protecting your ministry. You're building your ministry, my ministry, building your ministry. And God comes one day and He says, I want you to take that ministry and die to it. I want you to put it on the altar. Go out of business. Lord, not the ministry. You gave me the ministry, yes, but I gave it to you, all right. But it's become your God. It's become the apple of your eye. It's become the treasure of your heart. I'm the treasure of your heart. I'm to be the apple of your eye, and I don't have all of you there is to have yet. I want you to put your Isaac on the altar, and when I have all of Isaac, I'll have all of you there is to have. It may be a son. It may be a daughter. It may be your own health. It may be money. I don't know. You make your own application. All I'm praying tonight is that God will show us basically two things. Number one, who is the Ishmael in our life we're going to have to drive out. Dear God, show us our Ishmael. Show us our little plans that we've worked so hard on and we think so much of, and we take up offerings to support, and we've got brochures built around them, and Lord, this is the way it's going to be done, and God comes along and says, I want to go in a whole other direction, drive out Ishmael. We keep praying, God, that Ishmael might live before thee. He said, no, I've got an Isaac for you, but you're going to get rid of Ishmael. I pray God will show us who our Ishmaels are, and then I pray that He'd show us who our Isaacs are. Things that are dearest and nearest to our heart mean more to us than life itself. Am I willing? Can I trust God to the extent I'm willing to take and put it on the altar and say, Lord, I recognize possessions, not ownership. I have nothing. I don't even have a place in my heart for you. I don't own anything. I don't even own my own soul, my own heart. And if you want a place in my heart, you're going to have to carve it out all by yourself. Now, as I understand it so far, that's what it means to walk in faith and trust God.